On today's World Insight, U.S. political showdown over a vacant seat in the Supreme Court after the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the significance of the timing of her replacement. And in today's Pathfinder series, up close with Michael Pettis, an American finance professor and indie record label owner in Beijing. He shares what makes him optimistic and skeptical in China the past 2 decades.
There were so many great bands popping up all over China.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg leaves behind a legacy and a toss-up over her vacant seat. Her death has set up a heated political battle over who should pick her replacement and when. All because the presidential election is so close. President Donald Trump hailed the late justice as a titan of the law. He also announced a list of 20 potential nominees, including 3 sitting senators. Some law experts are worried Ginsburg's passing could dramatically alter the balance of the court, with conservatives having a possible 6-3 majority. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the Senate will vote on a replacement even with the presidential election coming up. But Democratic standard-bearer Joe Biden said her replacement should not be nominated until after the presidential election in November. For more on the latest development in Washington, we are joined by Bruce Fein, constitutional lawyer, former Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan. In Iowa City, Timothy Hagel, a professor of political science with the University of Iowa. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Of course, the world has been sad upon the news of the pass away of RBG, certainly a historic figure, particularly in terms of her contribution to the gender equity in the justice system. But Mr. Fein, I know you personally interacted with her throughout your career.
Yes, I had occasion to lunch with her intermittently when she was on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. She often had foreign jurists come and join us from Malaysia, Singapore, elsewhere. She was very eclectic in her intellectual interest. When she was a Supreme Court Justice, I visited her chambers from time to time with female lawyers who were eager to be inspired by her example. She was completely unpretentious, unfailingly courteous, a wonderful listener. She wasn't a school marm in her attitude, eager to laugh. She wouldn't take herself too seriously, but a very diligent and careful writer. I think her career, even antedating the U.S. Supreme Court, was quite storied. She virtually single-handedly argued cases in the Supreme Court, beginning with a case called Reed versus Reed in 1971, that elevated the status of women to a very rigorous category of suspicion on gender discrimination cases, that virtually made the Equal Rights Amendment superfluous. So she surely lived a career that every woman should admire and adulate and seek to emulate.
There's also a lot of admiration from this part of the world in China. If you look at the social media, for example, WeChat moments, a lot of people over the days have been talking about her stories and trying to get inspirations as a result. Professor Hagel, but it's also political, isn't it? Particularly leading up to the presidential election. The choice of a new Supreme Court justice couldn't be more political.
Unfortunately, that's true, and it's a bygone era of the times when Justice Ginsburg herself was confirmed to the Supreme Court by an overwhelming majority, and her ideological opposite, Justice Scalia, who died previously, and they were good friends, also was confirmed to the court overwhelmingly. And it's too bad that these days the politics plays such an important role, but on the other hand, we also know that the Supreme Court is very important in deciding a lot of issues that are hot-button issues before the court these days, and the politics makes a difference. And so it's unfortunate that almost immediately upon her death, people started playing the political game.
The reason why people pay so much attention to her is not only because of her achievements, but also because she is one of the crucial members among the 9 so-called the Supreme Court justices at critical point in terms of where ideologically or politically the Supreme Court likely to tend to be in the near future. Dr. Hagel, upon that, what do you make of the current debate already beginning among the Republicans and also certainly between the Republicans and the Democrats about the nominee?
Well, it's hard to say what's going to happen. There are certainly arguments that President Trump shouldn't nominate someone. When Justice Scalia died, there were similar arguments from the other side that Obama shouldn't appoint someone to replace him because it's an election year. But on the other hand, the president, regardless of whether it's an election year or not, has the authority to appoint someone. Then the question is whether the Senate's going to take up that nomination and have a vote on it. It's not entirely surprising that if the Senate is controlled by the same party as the president, they would be more inclined to do so. But if they are controlled by the opposite party, they would be less inclined to do so. And that's sort of where we're at now. And everything else is more or less political gamesmanship.
Mr. Fain, so far we have been hearing from news coming from your country suggesting 2 Republican female senators have been speaking out, and yet we do not know. There's at least a 4 needed in the Republican Party to vote against before the putting down of a nomination. So, Mr. Fain.
You're correct. Right now, the Republican majority is 53 to 47, and because under the Constitution, if there's a 50-50 tie in the Senate, the Vice President casts the deciding vote, and that would be Mike Pence, who clearly would vote to confirm any nominee of Mr. Trump. Now, we have Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who have said rather firmly they will not vote on a successor to Ruth Bader Ginsburg before Election Day, November 3rd. There are at least 2 other candidates who might join their ranks, Mike Lee and Mitch Romney of Utah. Their seats are not vulnerable. Mitch Romney, you may recall, voted in favor of one article of impeachment against Mr. Trump and incurred Mr. Trump's wrath, so he really doesn't have much to worry about in terms of his relations with Mr. Trump if he decided he would not vote to favor a confirmation vote before November 3rd. So Mr. McConnell clearly could lose 4 votes and have this stymied. Now, the closest historical analogy to what we have now is what we call the Midnight Judges Act of 1801. In 1800, there was a overwhelming victory of the Democratic Republicans by Thomas Jefferson over John Adams, and the Federalist Party wanted to pack the judiciary to cling to power, at least in one branch of government, in the lame duck session. It passed a Judgeship Act creating 16 circuit judges, but it so evoked the wrath of the American people that the act was soon repealed. All 16 judgeships were abolished. The Supreme Court upheld the abolition, and the Federalist Party disappeared. There was a similar but not exact analogy in 1937 when Franklin Roosevelt wanted to pack the court by creating 6 new vacancies who he would fill with his New Dealer loyalists. The American people again turned against Franklin Roosevelt, and I think the Republicans are risking a repeat of those 2 historical incidents if they try to rush a nomination before there's a vote in November 3rd, especially since the Republicans basically took the same position in 2016 with Merrick Garland.
I see. Professor Hagel, about politics, if President Trump and also the majority leader of the Republican Party keep on pressuring on having a new nominee, whether there's going to be political backlash or not.
Even though they have the right to nominate someone and bring it up on the Senate and perhaps vote one way or the other, it's basically the political game that has to be played here. And if they do it before the election, will it cost a number of senators? There are a number of senators that are in vulnerable seats that are running for re-election, including a few that are on the Judiciary Committee. And so there's some question about whether they would feel comfortable in having that vote, even to the extent that they would be willing to support Trump's nominee, assuming he nominates someone. Would that hurt them politically? Would they lose the election? Would that mean that the Democrats then get a majority in the Senate? There are a lot of considerations here. And again, even to the extent that we saw some of this happen with Scalia's death and replacement, we're much closer to the election this time, so that sort of brings that particular factor much more to the fore than had been previously the case.
Of course, a lot of things are, at this point, fluid, as we say. They are still changing minute by minute. Yet, there is an issue that is fundamental. How are we going to see the current realities of the division of labor among the government branches, namely the White House and also the Capitol Hill and also, of course, the Supreme Court, which are important pillars of the U.S. political system? What might be the debate and leading up to the nominee, to the election, have an impact on the current reality? Professor Hagel and then Mr. Fain.
Well, I think that is a conversation that we're having right now, that there are a number of people that are particularly unhappy with the potential of Trump nominating someone and the Republican Senate bringing it up and are basically threatening things like, as was mentioned, the court packing plan previously didn't go well then. Maybe it'll go better this time if it's tried by the Democrats. It's hard to say. On the other hand, what's going to happen even with the election? If all of this occurs before Election Day, will the voters be in favor of it? Will they be against it? And it's a little bit hard to say at this point. I think that certainly those on the left supporting Democrats will be even more energized, but they were pretty energized to start with. I think maybe what might happen if Trump were to do this is that it would give more energy to some of the Trump supporters that may have been drifting off because they were a little tired of Trump at this point, so forth. But bottom line is that it's going to be close either way. It's just a matter of how contentious it will all be.
Mr. Fain, your thoughts?
Well, I think the regrettable aspect about this particular controversy is that no matter what, it clearly indicates a diminishing of what we would typically call the independence of the Supreme Court. Obviously, the justices emerge from a political process, but it's never been like this where it's so clearly partisan in character. It matters of degree. Justice Ginsburg's vote made Chief Justice Roberts kind of a swing vote, where the court was not clearly bent extremely right or left. For instance, the court invalidated Mr. Trump's effort to nullify the so-called DACA program, letting hundreds of thousands of children of undocumented aliens remain in the United States. It was even his own appointee, Neil Gorsuch, who wrote the opinion holding that transgender individuals were protected against gender discrimination under the civil rights laws. But I think the replacement of Justice Ginsburg by someone who, and if you look at the list, all would be thrown into a crowd of clear, sharp, partisan conservatism, would imbalance the court and result in legal doctrines that would create rather than suppress the more contentious part of our social divisions.
What do you think, Mr. Fain, are some of the signs to watch? What are some of the most important timings and steps to watch in order to have a better understanding to the question of we just discussed, leading up to the nominee of the candidate?
Well, the first will be the actual nomination itself. President Trump has stated, one, the nominee will be a woman. Number two, he stated it will be forthcoming this week. Now, there's, it's clearly just barely over a month and a few days before November 3rd. Now, typically what would happen, as I was involved in Supreme Court appointments when I was at the Justice Department, background investigations run by the FBI, and there would be a considerable time that would elapse between the naming of a nominee and the actual hearings that oftentimes lasted several days before a committee vote. So the speed with which Senator McConnell tries to accelerate the hearings will be key to examine whether it's feasible to even have a sensible vote where we've had a complete airing of the nominees' views and positions for the American people to see on TV, for it to be digested, a committee vote, and then going to the floor to consider whether it's going to look like they're cutting corners to ram this through before Election Day, which I think will clearly hurt the Republican Party. The American people do not want the judiciary to be a political football. That's been made clear throughout history.
So the nominee, which is to you the most important step, of course, the timing of it. And Professor Hagel.
Well, one thing to follow up on that is that because President Trump has released his list of potential nominees beforehand, a certain amount of work in terms of that background vetting has already taken place, I'm sure. Now, it will certainly intensify, but once, and even well before the death of Justice Ginsburg, that people were digging into that, both people that maybe were for the various people very against the various nominees, were looking to find information and either to support or oppose those people. So I'm not sure that it has to take that much time. Perhaps the closest appointment before an election day happened in 1956 when Justice Sherman Minton, had given President Eisenhower notice in early September that he was going to retire, and President Eisenhower appointed William Brennan to the Supreme Court on October 15th of 1956, so only a couple of weeks before the election. So, and it was a recess appointment, though, so they didn't go through the full process at that time, but nevertheless, it was very quick.
If I could just add that in terms of the background, it's not just, interest groups that examine the writings and whatever from newspapers and the public domain. The FBI has to conduct background investigation too. You may recall in the Brett Kavanaugh case, there was at least some protest that the FBI hadn't been given enough time to investigate certain of the allegations. And no, the FBI doesn't begin background investigation before a nominee is named. They don't have enough resources. It's way too costly. That process has not begun and will not begin until a name is actually submitted.
Remember last time, the nominee given by the president, in fact, has created such a stir. Of course, he eventually becomes a Supreme Court justice, but with a strenuous effort and uphill battle, quote unquote, by the White House and the majority leader. So if this time another one, will this be similar in terms of the efforts, or probably even more? Your personal judgment, Mr. Fain.
Now, I think this one will be very contentious. I believe if he nominates Amy Barrett, which she now sits on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, in Illinois, I think that will be very contentious because of her views on freedom of religion. That always spurs divisiveness, if you will. Some statements seem rather extreme, and her writings on the court. And I do believe this could turn into a very combustible confirmation hearing, given the fact that religion has emerged as what you might call a wedge issue between Republicans and Democrats in the past many elections.
Professor Hagel?
Yeah, I agree that certainly Judge Barrett had a lot of opposition even when she was being appointed to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. And so that's certainly something that Democrats would point to oppose her. But to a certain extent, it really doesn't matter who it is that Trump's going to appoint, that the left will be extremely unhappy with anybody that Trump appoints and will do whatever is necessary. And we've seen this, well, at least on social media, where a number of Democrats have basically said that they will oppose any Trump nominee with every means at their disposal.
I see. Before we go, I do want to lead the question to a similar direction, yet a bit different. That is going to be the relationship between the Supreme Court and the president. And yet we have seen the president setting a precedence of emphasizing executive orders rather than going through, quote unquote, the system. So what does that mean for future relationship? I mean, even right now, the relationship between the White House and the overall, quote unquote, system. With this precedence, what's likely to be the follow-up for the next president, be it Trump or Biden? Mr. Fain.
Well, presidents have increasingly resorted to executive orders to evade what they call is congressional gridlock, which is really just a pejorative for checks and balances at work. President Obama did it. President Trump even did it more, but it didn't begin on their watches. It's important to remember that one of Mr. Trump's executive orders, the one that talked to repeal, if you will, an executive order, a memorandum of President Obama relating to the DACA children, was held illegal by the U.S. Supreme Court, in an opinion by Chief Justice Roberts. So the court, I think, traditionally plays a checking role on executive excesses, but it's just a checking role. In the long run, the Supreme Court has never blocked over a substantial period, you know, the power of the executive and the congressional branches. And I believe that the greatest danger that we confront is the fact that the court gets involved too little, because Congress basically has surrendered its checking power over the president. They virtually no longer enforce subpoenas with serious sanctions, which they could undertake without going to court and waiting several years. And I believe that it's unfortunate that the Supreme Court simply does not and will not play the role that's necessary because of Congress's shortcomings to block executive overreach.
Mm-hmm. Professor Hagel.
Yeah, I would agree with that in the sense that, at least in the sense that the Supreme Court, even if somebody is ideologically in tune with a particular president, that doesn't necessarily mean that the court's going to go along with that president in all instances. Mm-hmm. That there is an independence to the Supreme Court that's still there. Now the question is how involved they want to be. If you tend to be more conservative, and if the majority in the court's more conservative, they may be more hands-off in terms of judicial restraint, not wanting to get involved, let the political branches sort it out. But on the other hand, if at some point there's a more liberal president, if Biden wins, or if the balance in the court shifts the other way, they may be more willing to allow the president to do whatever he or perhaps she wants at a particular time. So both the presidency switches back and forth ideologically, but the court does too, although often at a much slower pace.
Mm. Timothy Hagel, Bruce Fain, I learned a lot. Thank you so much for your insights. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up in our program, in today's Pathfinder series, up close with Michael Pettis, an American finance professor and indie record label owner in Beijing. He shares with me what makes him optimistic and skeptical all at the same time in the past 2 decades when it comes to China-U.S. relations. That interview right after this break.
So countries are going to have to go through significant adjustments, including China, which in many ways is the most exposed country to this globalization process.
Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Let's meet today Michael Pettis, an American with 2 hats, 2 impressive hats, I have to say. He's well-known finance professor with Peking University. Now he's even more known for being an incubator, quote-unquote, of China's indie rock music. In fact, he's considered the godfather of Beijing's indie music scene. When I first met Michael more than a decade ago, he was the most pessimistic economist. At least that's what his peers are joking about him. But the most optimistic rock club owner in Beijing. Things have changed a bit, of course, since then. He says he's no longer the most skeptical among the economists. His legendary rock club, B22, also closed in 2012 after the rock mecca of Beijing helped launch well-known bands such as Carstic Cars, Hedgehog, and Joyside. All these are big names now in China's indie music scene. This time, Michael invited me to his world, hidden in a lovely corner of Beijing's hutongs, and our conversation began from there. You are in a way become the incubator of Chinese rock music, particularly experimental, a little bit music, beginning from more than 12 or 14 years ago?
Started in 2005.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you realize that it eventually became what it is today?
You know, funnily enough, I knew it was going to happen. And the reason I say that is because there was a lot of pent-up frustration within the music scene. At that time, Chinese musicians really lacked self-confidence, but there were a lot of really good musicians. They just didn't know what to do with it. And so I was pretty sure that if we opened a sort of very snobbish New York-style music club, where we really put the musicians at the center of the scene, that something important would happen. Now, I didn't realize it was going to be so much. But from the very beginning, we had, you could just tell how many amazing artists were hanging out, dealing with each other, and making music. So it was a very exciting time.
How many musicians and bands you were working with then?
It's hard to say. By some accounts, nearly every musician from that period found their home at D22. So it was a lot of people.
Did you realize that's a big statement you just made?
You know, when we look back at the musicians that are really popular around China, that are making a big influence, or even popular abroad, almost all of them seem to have either made D22 their home club or started in D22. And really, it's not so surprising because there was nothing else for them. You know, at the time, if you were interested in music, that's where you went. So we were very lucky in our timing.
It was not a big place.
No. At its peak, we could take maybe 350 people, but it would be really crowded. Yeah.
But people, you could tell at that time, they just wanted to listen to something different.
It was, and the main thing was that a lot of musicians or people who wanted to be musicians hung out there. And they spoke with each other, they collaborated, they competed, so there was really a sense of a scene back then, yeah.
How did you work with them at that time?
You know, it really depends on the individual, but our approach was if we thought a musician was interesting or potentially interesting, we sort of gave them the run of the club. And they could do whatever they want. They could bring in their girlfriends or their boyfriends for free. They could drink for free. You know, it's just like we gave them the run of the club. And we wanted them really to feel that this was...
Stamp on the hand? Or
it was a stamp on the hand, but they didn't, you know, we treated them like celebrities.
Oh, that's
and we wanted it to become their club, and we wanted them to create the scene. We provided the space, and they were going to create the scene, and they did. They created an amazing scene.
Probably during that process, give you a very different input about China, about them.
Well, it was really exciting because when you think about what they had gone through, their entire lives were lived during a period in which China was socially transformed, maybe more than any other country in history in that 20-year period. So they came out of a very weird situation, sort of unlike anything else that anybody else has experienced. And so I knew, given such a strange background, that inevitably they were going to make really interesting music. And so it was a lot of fun to watch them sort of figure out what their music was going to sound like.
Give me some example. For example, some of the popular ones these days as a result of popular show. For example, Hedgehog.
Yeah, when they first played in our club, they were a completely unknown band, and we gave them a Wednesday night, which is not an important night. And they put on a performance that left me and the person in charge of booking bands, just our mouths dropped open. We couldn't believe how good they were and how energetic they were on stage. And we both said within a month they're going to be famous throughout the scene. And they were. Within a month, they were one of the most important bands that came out of that scene.
What are the others? Carsey Cars?
Carsey Cars, PK-14, Joyside are probably the most famous, the ones that have had the biggest influence on all the other bands. But Snapline, Quincy, Big Shark, Ourselves Besides Me, there were many, Choi Wan, many great bands that came out of that scene.
It's not only because you're running a bar, but rather you were trying to develop an independent label at that time.
Yes.
For all of these artists.
Well, the label started really as an accident. Carsey Cars had produced a record which we thought was great, and they were looking to sign with another label, but they weren't treated very well. And so Yang Haisong from PK14 and I thought, well, let's just start a label and put out a few records of bands that we liked. And the label just grew very quickly. It became the biggest indie label in China within 4 or 5 years, I think. And it was supported basically by the money I had made before I came to China working on Wall Street. And I lost a lot of money on the label, I can tell you. But it grew so quickly because suddenly every band that was interesting wanted to be on the label, and we never knew how to say no. So we kept bringing more and more bands onto the label. And about 4 or 5 years ago, there was an English magazine that listed the top 5 labels in Asia, and they listed us as #1, which was really satisfying. So here's
so nice.
This is where it's not so nice, but it's where we keep the archives of everything music related of the last 15, 20 years. So we have posters, we have magazines.
D22, second year anniversary.
This is a very famous poster which someone tried to buy from me for 10,000 kwai, and we said no. Eventually, all of this will go to a museum. When a museum wants to set up a museum of Chinese culture of this period, we have great stuff by artists.
Nice. So these are the posters.
Yes, this is by an artist called Chairman Sa, who did many of our posters, and in fact that one too. And he's become one of the most important artists emerging from the music scene. He does great, great work.
I see great history over here. It was the late 1990s that the Chinese rock scene really flourished, even commercialized. However, before that, it was mainly underground. And after that, it also went underground. Some of the big bands disbanded, and people were not encouraged by the so-called innovation within the music scene. So that was the backdrop.
Yes.
What was it like when you were working with these musicians, you know, the realities?
In the 1990s, I think there were a couple of waves of music, but they were very similar. Basically, it was the first time Chinese musicians had really dealt with rock. So most of them followed their models, their foreign models, quite closely. And at the end of the 90s, you started to see a few really strange, weird musicians develop. And they were not interested in sounding like anybody else. They wanted to do their own thing. And in the early, what was very important, I think, was that in the early 2000s, everybody on China got onto the internet. And this is really important because before that, these people had heard of composers like John Adams or Messiaen. They'd heard of bands like Velvet Underground. They'd heard of Charlie Parker, but they never heard the music. And then suddenly, once with the internet, you had 100 years of musical history just dumped on you in 2 years. And that has to be a really great way to approach all of this music without the historical baggage. It's all new and fresh to you. And I think that's why I always say we were lucky in our timing, because we opened the club within 1 or 2 years of the opening of the internet. And suddenly all of these musicians had so many ideas, they didn't know how to express it. And we said, here, express it here. And so that really happened. And I think one of the surprising things that everybody comments on is that each generation in China lasted only about 5 years, and then you'd have a whole new generation of musicians. And I think it had to do with that opening of the internet. Suddenly, so much material came through that the level of sophistication of the musicians went from almost 0 to almost 100 within 10 years. It's amazing. Within, you know, by 2010, young Chinese musicians in my club were introducing me to important New York musicians that I hadn't heard of. That's how sophisticated. They were way ahead of me within a few years. So that was very exciting.
Learning curve certainly is an exciting thing.
Yes.
But at the same time, you know, there has always been debate about learning from the others while at the same time creating originality. How do you see that combination so far?
I think there's a lot of stereotypes about Chinese culture that really, really bother me, because many people would listen to what the young musicians were doing and they were saying, this isn't original, this is copying the West, and by which they meant that this doesn't sound like what my stereotypes of Chinese music should be. But the point that I would make is that whatever your idea of what Chinese music should sound like from the past, that's dead. And it's dead because from basically 1990 or 1985 until 2000, China went through such a radical transformation. And it stopped becoming a rural country, it became an urban country. So you had young kids in China going to modern high schools, taking the subway, watching buildings being destroyed and rebuilt, spending all of their time on computers or on their smartphones. These were not the Chinese of 50 years ago. This is a very modern, urban China. So everything they did, by definition, was going to be different. And I think the problem was that we all approach it and we sort of think we know what it should sound like. And if it doesn't sound like that, we say, oh, it's fake. No, that's the wrong approach. Chinese culture is whatever Chinese artists do. And so what we should do is just listen to the artists, and whatever they say Chinese culture is, that's what it is. And what they're going to say is something quite different from what we're used to, because the experiences they went through are like nothing anybody else has ever experienced.
You know, there's debate about, for example, our Chinese contemporary art, whether that really reflects the changes and twists and turns of the Chinese society.
Well, I think that can often be a generational thing. I think that for a lot of artists doing their work in the 80s and 90s, China seemed like it had nothing, and everything interesting was foreign. And so there was this real attempt to do whatever the foreigners were doing. I remember meeting a very famous critic, and he told me China can never have an interesting music scene. And I said, why not? You know, America does, why can't China? He said, oh, because America's full of interesting things. China is so boring, it can't have a music scene. And I said, it's funny because that's what Americans say about America, and they say China's where the interest. So this is, we have a saying, the grass is always greener on the, in your neighbor's lawn. But I think a lot of that had to do with a lack of confidence. But what's impressed me is that the generation that came of age at the beginning of this century, they became much more confident. And again, we're missing the point because they're all doing really interesting stuff. I was on a BBC panel maybe 4 or 5 years ago talking about why is Chinese culture so bad? Why aren't they doing anything interesting? And I got very angry at them, and I said, it's because, you know, it's because they were looking for things. So they were saying Chinese musicians either have to do, you know, Peking opera or rural village music or Mongolian music, because that's Chinese.
In their eyes.
You know, what I was trying to explain to them is if you just look at what young urban creative people are doing, they're building this entire scene, and it's not what we expected. That's why we can't see it.
The 54-year-old Michael Pettis finds a perfect fit for his two passions, the economy and indie music. So we did the rounds at the Maybe Mars record studio in Beijing, an independent label which Michael created. While he shares his passion for music, he also sees China through the pragmatic lens of an economist, with some sound advice.
Maybe Mars office. You can see everybody is busy at work. These are the guys that support the whole Chinese music scene.
So you actually show the best part to all different sides, right? To the musicians, you're an economist. To the economic world, you are someone that's so cool.
A music guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, this way I can always pretend that I know what I'm doing.
Both worlds. 不错, fun. Great fun.
It is fun.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Mm. We see China was going through this up and down process of others' recognition of China, and then reflected in China's own mentality about itself. Now we are experiencing another, seems to be, period of time when China being questioned in all aspects.
Yeah. I think that shouldn't be a surprise. In my 2013 book, I argued that we were going through a process of a reversal of globalization, and that historically when that happens, geopolitical tensions rise, anti-foreign feeling rises, et cetera, et cetera. So it's true that a lot of anti-China feeling is arising around the world, but also anti-German feeling, anti-American feeling, anti-everybody. we're going through a period where nobody likes foreigners. Right? That's an exaggeration. But there'll be more and more criticism, and China is not immune from that. So all of these countries, we're going to spend another 3 or 4 difficult years geopolitically, and then hopefully we'll get through it and we'll go back to more normal times. People in each country think that they're the ones that are being unfairly criticized, but the truth is every country is being constantly criticized. You know, I'm part Spanish and French, and when I go back to Europe, everybody hates everybody. It's really, they're angry at the British, they're angry at the Germans, they're angry at the Russians. Everybody's angry at everybody.
But now, if you look at China-U.S. relations, particularly with, you know, access for people to go to each other's countries, it's very limited. It's not just because of COVID-19. It's much more than that.
Yeah. That's become a problem. It's become much harder for musicians to travel. Foreigners can't come to China. It's hard to the U.S. I think if you're a small country like Belgium, that could be a real problem, or New Zealand or something. Fortunately, countries like the U.S., China, Europe generally are big enough that even if you can't go abroad, you can continue interacting with very different musicians. But I'm hoping that this period doesn't last very long, because I think it is important for musicians and artists to be able to see what their contemporaries in other countries are doing.
Are we going to see very different years ahead,
yes.
Michael?
We've spent the last 30 years in this period of hyper-globalization, and there are so many problems, including huge income inequality, huge imbalances, that this has to be reversed. And the good news is that it will be reversed. The bad news is that the historical precedents suggest that it's only reversed with a great deal of difficulty. So countries are going to have to go through significant adjustments, including China, which in many ways is the most exposed country to this globalization process. So I would argue that the next 10 years we're going to see huge changes around the world, and they'll be difficult because change always is difficult, but it'll be interesting.
My interview with Michael Pettis, also known as the godfather of Beijing's indie rock music. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.